What if a person could live an entire lifetime without ever generating a single original thought of their own? Not influenced, not pressured, not confused, but fully constructed. That question sits at the center of what most readers miss in this character. Because Mr. Collins is usually treated as comic relief, awkward, excessive, socially unaware. But that interpretation collapses the moment you stop asking what he does and start asking what produces him. In the world of Pride and Prejudice, identity is not built from inner truth. It is built from external approval loops, status, recommendation, and institutional validation. So the real question is not whether Mr. Collins is intelligent. The real question is, what happens when intelligence is no longer allowed to become thought? And this is where the first contradiction appears. Because Mr. Collins is, functionally, correct most of the time. He understands hierarchy. He understands etiquette. He understands what to say, when to bow, when to agree. Yet something in him feels absent. Not wrong. Not mistaken. Absent. That absence is the first memory fragment, a perfectly spoken sentence with no internal author behind it. Now pause on that. Because in most social systems, correctness is treated as proof of consciousness. But here, correctness behaves like a replacement for consciousness. The more accurate he becomes socially, the less detectable his inner self seems to be. So what is actually happening? A deeper layer emerges. Mr. Collins is not thinking through reality. He is mirroring institutional expectations. His beliefs do not originate internally. They are inherited in real time from whatever structure is currently above him. Church, class, patronage, authority. Each one acts like a relay station for cognition. And here comes the scale shift. If a human being can function entirely through borrowed cognition, then thought itself is no longer a private act. It becomes an administrative function of society. This is where the concept becomes unsettling. Because the question stops being about one character. It becomes about whether consciousness can be replaced by compliance without anyone noticing the transition. That is the second memory fragment, a man who never disagrees because disagreement was never installed as an option. Now consider the contradiction at a structural level. If Mr. Collins were truly empty, he would collapse. But he doesn't. He operates. He writes. He speaks. He exists socially without friction. So emptiness, in this case, is not failure. It is stability. Which leads to a deeper consequence. A system that rewards alignment more than reflection will eventually produce individuals who cannot distinguish between belief and performance. And here the mystery sharpens. Did Mr. Collins ever choose anything at all? Or is choice itself unnecessary inside a perfectly functioning institutional loop? Because if every decision is pre-shaped by approval, hierarchy, and expectation, then what remains of the self is not a thinker, but a position inside a structure. And that raises a final unsettling question. If a person can be fully socially functional, fully coherent, fully correct, and still not generate independent thought, then how many layers of modern life are already operating on the same invisible principle, just without us noticing it yet? But here's where the structure becomes more unsettling. Because if Mr. Collins is not an exception, but a repeatable outcome, then the real question is not about him at all, it's about the system that makes him possible. What kind of environment produces a mind that never hesitates? Not a mind that is obedient once or twice, but a mind where hesitation itself is never generated in the first place. To understand this, we have to shift perspective from individual psychology to institutional physics. In the world of Pride and Prejudice, approval is not just social currency, it is cognitive architecture. It decides what is thinkable before thought even begins. And that leads to a disturbing implication. If every belief must pass through a filter of status, hierarchy, and permission, then thinking is no longer an internal process. It becomes a negotiation with invisible authority. Here is the contradiction. Mr. Collins appears confident in speech, but that confidence is not rooted in conviction. It is rooted in permission already granted. A memory fragment emerges, a sentence spoken so correctly that it no longer needs a speaker. So what happens to a mind like that over time? It doesn't break. It stabilizes. And stability becomes the disguise for something deeper. Because when every conclusion is pre-approved by structure, uncertainty is no longer a cognitive stage, it is eliminated entirely. There is no internal debate. No friction. No resistance. Just alignment. Now the perspective shifts again. Elizabeth Bennet represents the opposite force, not rebellion for its own sake, but cognitive friction. The ability to say, "I am not sure yet." That uncertainty is not weakness. It is the birthplace of independent thought. Without it, the mind becomes a closed circuit. And this is where the second memory fragment lands, a conversation where agreement happens so quickly that truth never has time to form. But here is the escalation. If a society rewards alignment more than exploration, then individuals like Mr. Collins are not rare. They are optimized. Not broken. Optimized. That changes the entire moral reading of the system. Because now the question is no longer, "Why is he like this?" The question becomes, "What does a society gain by producing people who cannot internally disagree?" And the consequence expands beyond personality into legacy. A civilization built on cognitive alignment produces efficiency, but at the cost of inner authorship. People begin to speak fluently without ever testing whether their thoughts belong to them. This is the third memory fragment, a polished voice repeating a truth it never questioned. But even this is not the deepest layer. Because if Mr. Collins is the product of optimization, then somewhere inside that system, independence is not just absent, it may be actively unnecessary. Which raises a destabilizing possibility. What if individuality is not suppressed, but simply not required for the system to function? And if that is true, then the final mystery is not about Mr. Collins at all. It is about whether consciousness itself is optional inside highly structured societies. And if so, what exactly is left of a person who never needed to become aware of themselves in the first place? And that question does not close here. It only gets sharper. Then the crisis begins to reveal itself not in what he says, but in what he can no longer generate. The question is no longer whether a mind can be shaped by a system. The question is what remains when shaping becomes complete. Because if every thought is filtered before it becomes language, then something essential is removed long before expression ever happens. Not emotion. Not intelligence. But authorship. And this is where the structure of pride and prejudice becomes more than a social environment. It becomes a cognitive ecosystem where thinking is only valid after it has been socially licensed. So the deeper question emerges. What happens to a person who has never had to defend a thought internally? Not defend it externally. Internally. Because defense requires friction. And friction requires an opposing voice. But in Mr. Collins' case, that opposing voice may never have formed in the first place. A memory fragment surfaces, a belief that arrives already fully assembled, never questioned, only delivered. Now the contradiction sharpens. He speaks with certainty, but certainty here is not the result of reasoning. It is the absence of alternative pathways. There is no internal debate collapsing into conclusion. There is only conclusion, standing alone, unchallenged. And that is where escalation begins. Because if a mind cannot generate internal opposition, then it cannot evolve. It can only repeat at higher volume. At the institutional level, this becomes even more critical. A system that rewards predictable cognition begins to prefer individuals who do not destabilize meaning. People who do not reinterpret rules. People who do not introduce ambiguity into structure. Which means the system does not merely tolerate Mr. Collins. It selects for him. And here is the second memory fragment, a voice speaking perfectly within rules that no longer require understanding to follow. But now the revelation begins to fracture. Because if this is true, then independence is not suppressed as an exception. It is excluded as an unnecessary variable. And that leads to a disturbing escalation. What if the absence of independent thought is not a failure of development, but a successful completion of design? This is where Elizabeth Bennet becomes structurally important again, not as opposition in personality, but as a cognitive anomaly. She introduces uncertainty into a system that prefers resolution. She delays conclusion in a world optimized for closure. And that delay is not inefficiency. It is resistance. A third memory fragment appears, a question that refuses to settle into an answer, even when everything around it demands closure. Now the scale shifts again. Because if a society begins to eliminate cognitive friction, it does not simply produce obedient individuals. It produces a reality where disagreement becomes unintelligible, not just unacceptable. And in that reality, Mr. Collins is not strange. He is coherent. Which leads to the most uncomfortable contradiction so far. The more perfect the system becomes at producing alignment, the less capable it becomes of recognizing that anything else is possible. And yet, something in the narrative still feels incomplete. As if coherence itself is hiding a missing variable. So the question expands beyond character, beyond society, beyond even cognition. If a mind can operate entirely within approval, and still function without breakdown, then what exactly defines the boundary between a living consciousness and a perfectly executed role inside a structure? And just beneath that question, another one begins to surface, one that has not yet fully formed, but is already changing everything it touches. Then the question finally shifts away from behavior and enters structure itself. If a mind can operate entirely through alignment, repetition, and institutional validation, then what exactly is still thinking inside it? Not in a metaphorical sense. In a functional sense. What remains that is not already pre-approved, pre-shaped, or pre-authorized? And this is where the revelation begins to surface, slowly at first, like a pattern that only becomes visible when you stop focusing on the individual and start observing the architecture surrounding him. The world of pride and prejudice is not simply social hierarchy. It is a cognitive filtration system where ideas do not survive based on truth, but based on compatibility with structure. And Mr. Collins is not an anomaly inside that system. He is its most stable output. A memory fragment appears, a man speaking with absolute certainty, not because he discovered truth, but because truth has already been filtered into acceptable form before it reaches him. That is the first revelation. He does not interpret reality. He receives pre-processed meaning. And once this becomes visible, everything else reorders itself. Because the contradiction dissolves, there was never a missing inner voice. There was only a system that never required one to exist in the first place. This is not emptiness as absence. It is emptiness as design efficiency. A second memory fragment surfaces, a perfectly structured sentence that feels complete, even though no one inside it is actually doing the thinking. Now the insight deepens. If a society optimizes for coherence, predictability, and approval alignment, then consciousness is no longer measured by depth of thought. It is measured by speed of adaptation to established meaning. Which means something radical is happening beneath the surface of interaction. Individuals like Mr. Collins are not failing to think. They are succeeding at a different definition of cognition entirely. And this is where consequence expands. Because a system that rewards pre-aligned cognition gradually erases the need for internal conflict. Without internal conflict, there is no tension. Without tension, there is no transformation. Without transformation, there is only continuation. And continuation begins to look like life, even when nothing is being generated internally anymore. A third memory fragment emerges, a polished voice that never pauses long enough to doubt itself, because doubt has no operational value inside its environment. Now the scale shifts sharply. What appears to be a personality is actually a distribution point for institutional logic. Mr. Collins is not an individual navigating society. He is society speaking through a stabilized channel with no resistance. And once that becomes clear, the deeper implication emerges. If identity can be reduced to structural compliance, then individuality is not lost. It is rendered unnecessary. And that leads to a greater question that destabilizes everything previously assumed. If consciousness does not require independent thought to function socially, then what exactly are we recognizing when we say a person is aware? And even more unsettlingly, if awareness is not defined by inner authorship but by external coherence, then how many forms of human presence have we already mistaken for minds, when they might only be perfectly optimized reflections of systems that no longer need anyone to think at all? Then the real question is no longer about whether the system shapes thought. It is about whether thought was ever meant to exist independently inside that system at all. Because once you remove the assumption that consciousness must begin with internal authorship, everything reconfigures. In the world of Pride and Prejudice, what appears as personality is often just the visible layer of deeper social machinery. And Mr. Collins is not a deviation from that machinery. He is its most transparent expression. The revelation is this: he is not someone who lost his inner voice. He is someone in whom the concept of an inner voice was never structurally necessary. A memory fragment surfaces, a perfectly articulated sentence that feels complete not because it was deeply thought, but because it was fully compatible with the world it came from. That is the core mechanism. Mr. Collins functions as a convergence point between institutional expectation and personal expression, where the boundary between the two collapses entirely. What he says is not chosen against alternatives. It is selected by compatibility. And this is where the deeper insight emerges. If every possible thought is evaluated before it becomes conscious, then consciousness itself becomes a filtering layer, not a creative one. It does not generate meaning. It approves meaning that already fits. This redefines the entire core conflict. It is no longer individual versus society. It is generative thought versus pre-structured meaning. And once seen this way, Mr. Collins stops being a character and becomes a system output. A living demonstration of what happens when interpretation is fully externalized. A second memory fragment appears, a conversation that moves smoothly, without hesitation, because every response already exists in a socially approved form before it is spoken. Now the expansion begins. If a society reaches a point where meaning is continuously pre-validated, then originality is not rejected. It is simply never required to survive. And that creates a profound structural consequence. Human expression becomes indistinguishable from institutional echo. Not because people are forced to conform, but because deviation loses functional value. This is where the scale shifts dramatically. Mr. Collins is not a critique of one personality type. He is a model of cognitive efficiency inside a closed interpretive system. A system that rewards alignment so consistently that divergence becomes structurally invisible. And here lies the final insight of this stage. The absence of inner authorship is not experienced as loss by the system itself. Because the system does not measure depth of thought. It measures stability of output. Which means what we call self may not be an origin point at all. It may be a stabilized interface between expectation and expression. A third memory fragment emerges, a voice that sounds fully human, yet never risks saying anything that was not already anticipated by the structure listening to it. Now the consequence becomes unavoidable. If identity is defined by compatibility rather than creation, then the most coherent individuals are not those who think deeply, but those who think within the narrowest margin of acceptable variation. And that leads to a final philosophical fracture. If a mind can function perfectly without generating independent meaning, then what exactly is being lost when we call something spiritually absent? And what are we actually measuring when we assume presence still requires inner origin? Once the system reaches full efficiency, something unexpected happens. Nothing breaks. Nothing collapses. Nothing resists. Instead, everything continues perfectly. And that is precisely the consequence no one notices at first. Because in the world of Pride and Prejudice, coherence is treated as virtue. Social alignment is treated as intelligence. Predictability is treated as stability. And within that framework, a figure like Mr. Collins does not represent dysfunction. He represents completion. But completion carries a hidden cost. A memory fragment surfaces, a voice that never hesitates, not because it is certain, but because uncertainty has no structural permission to exist. That is the first consequence. When a mind is fully absorbed into institutional expectation, it does not become empty. It becomes fully occupied. There is no unused space where independent meaning can emerge. Every cognitive pathway is already assigned a destination. And this is where the legacy begins to form. Mr. Collins is not remembered because he is extreme. He is remembered because he is reproducible. He demonstrates what happens when identity is no longer negotiated internally, but distributed externally across hierarchy, etiquette, and approval. A second memory fragment appears, a conversation where disagreement feels physically impossible, not because of fear, but because no alternative formulation ever reaches the surface. Now the expansion deepens. The consequence is not simply psychological. It is structural. A society that produces highly aligned individuals begins to lose its capacity for internal divergence. And without divergence, systems cannot reinterpret themselves. They can only maintain what already exists. That is the quiet transformation happening beneath the surface. Not collapse. Preservation. And preservation, when taken far enough, becomes its own form of rigidity. The legacy of Mr. Collins, then, is not personality. It is methodology. He shows what happens when human expression becomes indistinguishable from institutional replication. Not forced. Not coerced. But optimized. This is why he remains unsettling even without conflict. Because there is no visible struggle to point at. Only function. And function without friction creates a deeper question about what we define as life inside systems that prioritize consistency. Over-exploration. A third memory fragment emerges, a perfectly structured statement that feels complete, yet carries no trace of an original decision behind it. Now the scale shifts again. What begins as one character becomes a template. And what begins as a template becomes a cultural possibility. The idea that a person can exist entirely within alignment and still be considered fully realized. But here is where the reflection turns inward. Because if a system can produce individuals who never deviate and still remain fully operational, then deviation itself is no longer necessary for survival. It becomes optional. Or worse, irrelevant. And once something becomes irrelevant, it disappears without resistance. Not through suppression. Through redundancy. This is the deepest consequence so far. A world optimized for coherence does not erase individuality. It gradually stops requiring it. And in that transition, something subtle happens to meaning itself. Meaning no longer emerges from tension between internal and external thought. It emerges from compatibility with structure. Which means legacy is no longer about what someone creates. It becomes about how seamlessly they integrate. And that brings everything to a final scale shift. Mr. Collins is not a warning in the traditional sense. He is a demonstration of what remains when the boundary between thought and system becomes indistinguishable. A fourth memory fragment surfaces, a presence that feels entirely real, yet leaves no trace of internal authorship behind its words. And now the final question begins to form, but it does not resolve. If a life can be fully coherent, fully functional, fully socially validated, while never requiring independent inner authorship, then what exactly survives when we assume that consciousness must always be defined by resistance to structure? And if there is nothing left that requires resistance at all, then what are we truly measuring when we call something a mind? And in the end, the most unsettling realization is not about what this kind of mind becomes. It is about what we quietly accept as normal, without ever noticing the transformation. Because in the world of pride and prejudice, social harmony is often treated as the final proof that everything is functioning correctly. But harmony, when examined closely, can also be the absence of internal resistance rather than the presence of true understanding. And that is where everything converges. A final memory fragment surfaces, a perfectly aligned voice, speaking with complete confidence, leaving no trace of hesitation, not because truth has been discovered, but because nothing inside the structure required it to be questioned. That is the last echo of Mr. Collins. Not as a person, but as a pattern that continues to repeat wherever systems reward consistency over inner authorship. And this is the final insight. What we often interpret as a fully formed identity may actually be something far more fragile and far more efficient, a stabilized interface between expectation and expression, where meaning is not created, but continuously approved in real time by the environment that surrounds it. In that sense, the core conflict was never about individuality against society. It was about whether individuality is something that must actively exist at all in order for a human being to function inside a coherent system. And if function no longer requires internal authorship, then the definition of presence itself begins to shift. A fourth memory fragment appears, the clearest one yet, a sentence that feels complete the moment it is spoken, yet carries no visible origin of thought behind it, as if meaning has become self-executing. Legacy, then, is no longer measured by what a person changes in the world. It is measured by how easily they disappear into the logic of the world without leaving a trace of resistance behind. And that is why this story continues to matter beyond its setting, beyond its characters, beyond its time. Because it forces a quiet but uncomfortable reflection on modern life itself. How much of what feels like clarity is actually alignment? How much of what feels like conviction is actually conditioning? And how much of what we call a self is simply the most efficient version of agreement we have learned to produce? The deeper meaning is not that people lose themselves. It is that systems can become so complete that self is no longer required to begin with. And once that possibility is visible, it cannot be unseen. So the final question remains, unresolved and widening into something larger than the story that inspired it. If a human being can exist in perfect coherence with the world around them, without ever needing to generate anything truly independent within, then what exactly are we witnessing when we say a mind is alive, and what part of us is still certain that aliveness requires an author at all?